Chapter 4. The River of Time. Veda Kong and Darveder were standing on the little round flying platform as it swept slowly over the endless steppes. The thick, flowering grasses rolled in waves under the gentle breeze. In the distance they could see a herd of black and white cattle, the descendants of animals bred by crossing yaks, domestic cows and buffaloes. This unchanging lowland with its low hills and quiet rivers and wide valleys, a part of Earth's crust once known as the Hanti-Mansi territory, breathed the peace of great open spaces. Darveder was gazing contemplatively at the land that had formerly been covered with the dismal swamps and sparse, stunted woods of Yamal. It brought to mind a picture by an old master that had impressed itself on his memory when he was still a child. Where the river curved round a high promontory there stood a church, timber-built and gray with time, its lonely gaze turned towards the wide fields and grasslands across the river. The tiny cross on the dome was black under masses of low black clouds. In the little graveyard behind the church, a cluster of birches and willows bowed their tousled heads to the wind. Their low-hanging boughs almost brushed the rotting crosses, thrown down by time and storm and overgrown with fresh damp grass. Across the river, gigantic violet-gray masses of cloud were piling up until they became tangibly dense. The wide river gave off a cruel, steel-colored gleam, a cold gleam that lay on everything round about. The whole countryside, far and near, was wet in the miserable autumn drizzle, so cold and uninviting in those northern latitudes. The whole palette of blue-gray-green tones used in the picture told of stretches of barren land, where it was hard for man to live, where man was cold and hungry, where he felt so strongly the loneliness that was typical of the long-forgotten days of human folly. This picture, seen in a museum, had seemed to Darveder to be a window looking into the past. It was kept under a plexiglass shield, its colors ever fresh in the illumination of invisible rays. Without a word, Darveder looked at Veda. The young woman put her hand on the rail around the platform. With her head bent she stood there, deep in thought, watching the stems of the tall grass as they bent to the wind. Wave after wave swept slowly across the feathergrass, and equally slowly the round platform floated over the steppe. Tiny hot whirlwinds rushed suddenly on the travelers, ruffled Veda's hair and dress, and breathed heat mischievously into Darveder's eyes. The automatic stabilizer, however, worked more rapidly than thoughts, and the flying platform merely heaved or swayed slightly. Darveder bent over the chart frame. The strip of map was moving quickly, showing their movement. Hadn't they flown too far north? They had crossed the 60th parallel some time before, had passed the junction of the Irtish and the Ob, and were approaching the plateau known as the North Siberian Uval or Highlands. The two travelers had become accustomed to the open country during their 4 months at the excavation of ancient grave mounds in the hot steppes of the Altai lowlands. It was as though the explorer CS of the past had traveled back to times when only occasional small parties of armed horsemen crossed the southern steppes. Veda turned and pointed ahead without a word. A dark island, seemingly torn off from the earth, was floating in streams of heated air. A few minutes later the platform approached a small hill, probably the slag heap of what had once been a mine. There was nothing left of the buildings, and the pit just that slag heap overgrown with wild cherry. The round flying platform suddenly listed. Darveder, acting like an automaton, seized Veda by the waist and jumped to the opposite, rising side of the platform. It straightened out for a fraction of a second, only to crash down flat at the foot of the hill. The shock absorbers took the shock, and the recoil threw Veda Kong and Darveder out onto the hillside where they landed in a clump of stiff bushes. After a minute's silence, the stillness of the steppe was broken by Veda's low contralto laugh. Darveder tried to picture the look of astonishment on his own scratched face. The moment of surprised stupefaction passed, and he joined in Veda's merriment, glad that she was unharmed and that there were no ill results from the accident. "There's a good reason for forbidding these platforms to fly higher than 8 meters, she said with a slight gasp. "Now I understand. If anything goes wrong, the machine drops down in a second, and you have to rely entirely on the shock absorbers. What else can you expect? It's the price you have to pay for little weight and compactness." "I'm afraid we'll have to pay a still higher price for all the safe flights we've had," said Darveder with an indifference that was slightly exaggerated. "In what way?" asked Veda seriously. The faultless functioning of the stabilizing instruments presupposes very intricate mechanisms. I'm afraid I should need a long time to find out how they work. We'll have to get away from here in the way the poorest of our ancestors did. Veda, with a sly glint in her eyes, held her hand out to Darvetter, and Lai lifted her out of the lushes with an easy movement. They went down to the wrecked platform, put some healing salve on their scratches, and glued up the tears in their clothes. Veda lay down in the shade of a bush, and Darvetter began to study the causes of the mishap. As Lai had suspected, something had gone wrong with the stabilizer, and it had cut out the engine. No sooner had Darvetter opened the lid of the apparatus than he realized that there could be no question of repairing it. It would take him too long to delve into the nature of the intricate electronics before he could even start on it. With a sigh of annoyance, he straightened his aching back and glanced at the bush where Vedakong had curled herself up trustfully. The hot, silent steppe, as far as the eye could see, was devoid of people. 2 big birds of prey circled over the waving blue mirage of the grass. The obedient machine had become nothing more than a dead disk that lay helpless on the dry earth. Darvetter experienced a strange feeling of loneliness, of being cut off from the whole world, something that came from inside him where it had existed apart from his mind in the dull memory of his body's cells. All the same time, Lai was not afraid of anything. Let night come, the naked eye would see over greater distances, and they would certainly see a light somewhere that they could make for. They had been flying without luggage and had not even taken a radio telephone, torches, or food with them. There was a time when we could have died in the steppes if we had not had a sufficient supply of food with us. And water, thought Vetter, shielding his eyes from the bright sunlight. He noted a patch of shade under a cherry bush near Veda and stretched himself, carefree, on the ground, the dry grass stalks pricking his body through his light clothing. The soft rustling of the wind and the heat brought forgetfulness. Thoughts flowed drowsily, and pictures of long-forgotten days passed slowly, one after another, through his memory, a long procession of ancient peoples, tribes, and individuals. It was as though a gigantic river of time were flowing out of the past, with the events, people, and clothes changing every second. Vetter! Through his sleepiness, he heard the voice of his beloved calling him. Awakening, he sat up. The red ball of the sun was already touching the darkening horizon, and not the slightest breath of wind was to be felt in the still air. "My Lord Vetter," said Veda, playfully bowing before him in imitation of the women of ancient Asia, "would you deem it unworthy to awaken and remember my existence?" Darvetter did a few physical jerks to drive away sleep. Veda agreed with his plan to await darkness. Nightfall found them engaged in a lively discussion of their past work. Suddenly, Darvetter noticed that Veda was shivering. Her hands were cold, and he realized that her light clothing was not much protection against the cold nights of those high latitudes. The summer night on the 60th parallel was quite light, and they were able to gather a fairly large pile of twigs. An electric spark discharged by the machine's big accumulator gave Darvetter fire, and the bright flames of burning brushwood soon made the surrounding darkness blacker as it showered its life-giving warmth on the travelers. Shivering Veda soon opened out again like a flower in the sunlight, and the two of them fell into a sort of almost hypnotic reverie. Somewhere deep down in man's spirit, left over from that 100,000 years, during which fire had been his chief asylum and his salvation, there remained an ineradicable sense of comfort and calm that came over man, sitting by a fire surrounded by cold and darkness. "What's worrying you, Veda?" said Darvetter, disturbing the silence. There were signs of sorrow in the lines of his companion's mouth. "I was thinking of that woman, the one in the kerchief," answered Veda, quietly, her eyes fixed on the burning embers that were collapsing in a shower of gold. Darvetter understood her immediately. The day before their trip on the flying platform, they had completed the opening of a big Scythian kurgan, or grave mound. Inside the well-preserved log vault lay the skeleton of an old man, a chieftain. The vault was surrounded by the bones of horses and slaves lying round the fringe of the mound. The old chieftain lay with his sword, shield, and armor beside him, and at his feet was the skeleton of a quite young woman in a crouching position. Over the skull lay a silk kerchief that had at some time been tightly wound about her face. Despite all their efforts, they had not managed to preserve the kerchief, although, before it had fallen to dust, they had succeeded in copying the outlines of the beautiful face impressed on it thousands of years before. The kerchief preserved another awful detail. the imprint of eyes starting out of their sockets. The young woman had undoubtedly been strangled and then thrown into her husband's tomb to accompany him on his journey into the unknown world beyond the grave. She could not have been more than 19, her husband no less than 70, a ripe old age for those days. Narrated recalled the heated discussion that had taken place between the younger members of Veda's expedition. Had the woman married him willingly, or had she been forced to it? Why? For the sake of what? If she married him for a great and devoted love, why had she been killed instead of being treasured as the best memorial to him in the world he was leaving? Then Veda Kong spoke. For a long time she had been looking at the grave mound, her eyes shining, trying to penetrate mentally into the depths of the past. Try to understand those people. The great expanse of the steppe was to them really boundless, with horses, camels, and oxen as the only means of transport at their disposal. These great spaces were inhabited by little groups of nomad herdsmen that not only had nothing to unite them, but who were, on the contrary, living in constant enmity with one another. Insults and animosity accumulated from generation to generation. Every stranger was an enemy. Every other tribe was legitimate prey that promised herds and slaves, that is, people who were forced to work under the whip, like cattle. Such a system of society brought about, on the one hand, greater liberty for the individual in his petty passions and desires than we know, and, dialectically, on the other, excessive limitation in relations between people, a terrible narrow-mindedness. If a nation or tribe consisted of a small number of people capable of feeding themselves by hunting and the gathering of fruits, even as free nomads they lived in constant fear of enslavement or annihilation by their militant neighbors. In cases when the country was isolated and had a big population capable of setting up a powerful military force, the people paid for their safety from warlike raids by the loss of their liberty, since despotism and tyranny always developed in such powerful states. This was the case with ancient Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. Women, especially if they were beautiful, were the prey and the playthings of the strong. They could not exist without the protection of a man and were completely in his power. If the man who owned them died, nothing was left to them but an unknown and ruthless life at the cruel and greedy hands of another man. Her own will and endeavors meant so little for a woman, so terribly little that when she was faced with such a life, who knows, perhaps death may have seemed the easier way. Veda's ideas created a great impression on the young people. The finds in the Sivan grave mound were something that Narrated, too, would never forget. As though reading his thoughts, Veda moved closer and slowly stirred the burning twigs, following with her eyes the blue tongues of flame that ran across the coals. What a tremendous amount of courage and fortitude was needed to be oneself in those days, not to become degraded but to make one's way in life, Veda Kong said softly. It seems to me that we exaggerate the difficulties of life in ancient days, said Narrated. Quite apart from the fact that people were used to it, the chaotic nature of society was the cause of a variety of incidental happenings. Man's strength and willpower struck flashes of romantic joy out of that life, in the same way as steel strikes sparks from gray stone. I shudder more at the last stages of development of capitalist society, towards the end of the era of disunity, when the people, shut up in towns, cut off from nature, exhausted by monotonous labor, grew weaker and more indifferent as they succumbed to widespread diseases. I am also at a loss to understand why it took our ancestors so long to understand the simple fact that the fate of society depended on them alone, that a community is what the moral and ideological development of all its members makes it, that it depends wholly on the economy. The perfect form of scientifically organized society is not merely a quantitative accumulation of productive forces, but a qualitative stage in development. It's all really very simple, answered Narrated. Furthermore, there is the understanding of dialectical interdependence, that new social relations are as improbable without new people as are the new people without the new economy. When this was realized, it led to the greatest attention being paid to education, to the physical and mental development of man. When was this finally realized? In the era of disunity, at the end of the Fission Age, soon after the Second Great Revolution. It's a good thing it didn't come later. The destructive means of war. Narrated stopped suddenly and turned towards the open space between the fire and the hill. The thunder of heavy hooves and panting breath came from somewhere nearby, making the two travelers jump to their feet. A gigantic black bull appeared before the fire. The flames were reflected in blood-red lights in his wicked rolling eyes. He was snorting and pawing up the dry ground, obviously contemplating an attack. In the feeble light he seemed of gigantic size. His lowered head was like a granite boulder, his mighty withers rose behind it like a mountain of solid muscle. Never before had either Veda Kong or Dar Vader been close to an animal that possessed malicious, death-dealing strength, and whose unthinking brain was deaf to the voice of reason. Veda pressed her hands tightly to her bosom and stood stock still, as though hypnotized by the vision that appeared suddenly out of the darkness. Dar Vader, obeying some powerful instinct, stood in front of the bull to protect Veda, as his ancestors had done thousands and thousands of times before him. The hands of the man of the new era, however, were empty. Veda jumped to the right, he just managed to say as the bull plunged at them. In their rapidity of action, the well-trained bodies of the two travelers were equal to the primeval agility of the bull. The giant flashed past them and crashed into the thicket of bushes, and Veda and Dar found themselves in darkness a few paces from the platform. Away from the fire, the night did not seem so dark, and Veda's dress could no doubt be seen from some distance. The bull extracted itself from the wild cherry bushes, and Dar Vader heaved his companion towards the machine. With well-performed vault, she landed on the little platform. While the animal was tearing up the ground with its hoofs, Dar Vader got onto the platform beside Veda. They exchanged hurried glances, and in the eyes of his companion, Dar saw nothing but frank admiration. He had removed the cover from the motor during the day when he had tried to find out how it worked. Mustering every ounce of strength, he tore the cable of the balancing field from the rail of the platform, put one end under the spring of the accumulator terminal, and pushed Veda protectively to one side. In the meantime, the bull had its horn under the rail, and the machine was swaying dangerously. With a happy grin, Dar Vader pushed the end of the cable into the animal's muzzle. There was a flash of lightning, a dull thud, and the savage beast collapsed in a heap. "Oh, you've killed it," exclaimed Veda disapprovingly. "I don't think so, the ground's dry," exclaimed the ingenious hero with a smirk of satisfaction. As though in confirmation of his words, the bull grunted feebly, got to its feet, and, without looking round, staggered off at a trot from the scene of its disgrace. The travelers returned to their fire, and another armful of twigs gave new life to the dying embers. "I don't feel the cold anymore," said Veda. "Let's climb the hill." The top of the hill hid the light of the fire from them, and the pale stars of the northern summer formed balls of mist on the horizon. There was nothing to be seen in the west. In the north, rows of lights, faintly discernible, flickered on the slopes of some hills. In the south burned the bright star of a herdsman's watchtower, also a long way off. "Too bad, we'll have to walk all night," muttered Dar Vader. "No, look over there." Veda pointed to the east, where 4 lights placed in the form of a square had flashed on suddenly. They were only a couple of miles away. Taking note of the direction by the stars, they returned to the fire. Veda Kong stopped for a while before the dying embers, as though trying to remember something. "Farewell to our home," she said contemplatively. "The nomads probably had such homes as this all the time, uncertain and short-lived. Today I have become a woman of that epoch." She turned to Dar Vader and put her arm trustingly round his neck. "I felt the need for protection so strongly. I was not afraid, it wasn't that. But there was some sort of tempting submission to fate, or so it seems." Veda placed her hands behind her head and stretched herself gracefully before the fire. A second later, her dimming eyes had again acquired their roguish sparkle. "All right, lead the way, hero," and the tone of her deep voice became gentle and filled with unfathomable mystery. The bright night was full of the perfumes of grasses, the rustling of small animals, and the cries of night birds. Veda and Dar walked cautiously, afraid of falling into some unseen hole or crack in the dry earth. The brush-headed grass stalks stealthily grazed their ankles. Dar Vader looked around vigilantly whenever they came in sight of dark clusters of bushes. Veda laughed softly. "Perhaps we should have taken the accumulator and the cable with us?" "You're thoughtless, Veda," said Dar Vader good-humoredly. "More so than I thought." The young woman suddenly became serious. "I felt your protection too strongly. And Veda began to speak, or rather to think aloud, about further plans for the work of her expedition. The first stage of the work at the grave mounds on the steppes was finished, and her workers had returned to their old employments or were seeking something new. Der Wieder, however, had not chosen another job, and was free to follow the woman he loved. Judging by reports that reached them en masse, work was going well. Even if he had done badly, the council would not have appointed Der Wieder again so soon. In the Great Circle era, it was not thought advisable to keep people too long at any one job. The most valuable possession of man, his creative inspiration, grew weaker, and he could only return to an old job after a long break. Doesn't our work seem petty and monotonous to you after 6 years' communion with the cosmos? Veda's clear and attentive glance was fixed on him. This isn't petty or monotonous work, he objected, but it certainly doesn't provide me with that tension to which I am accustomed. I need the strain, otherwise I'll become too calm and good-natured, as though I were being treated with blue sleep. Blue sleep, began Veda, and the catch in her breath told Der Wieder more than the burning cheeks that he could not see in the dark. I'm going to continue my exploration farther to the south, she said, interrupting herself, but not until I have gathered a new group of volunteer diggers. Until then, I am going to take part in the maritime excavations I have been asked to help there. Der Wieder understood her, and his heart beat faster with joy. A second later, however, he had hidden his feelings in a distant corner of his heart and hurried to Veda's help. Do you mean the excavation of the submarine city to the south of Sicily? He asked. I saw some wonderful things from there in the Atlantis Palace. No, not there. We're working on the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and India now. We are looking for cultural treasures under the water, beginning from the Credo-Indian period and ending with the Dark Ages. You mean what was hidden, or, more often, simply thrown into the sea when the islands of civilization were destroyed under the impact of new forces, fresh, barbaric, ignorant, and reckless. That is something I can understand, said Der Wieder thoughtfully, his eyes carefully studying the whitish plain. I can also understand the great destruction of ancient civilizations when the states of antiquity, strong in their bonds with nature, were unable to make changes in their world to cope with the growing horror of slavery and the parasitic upper strata of society. And people exchanged the primitive materialism that had led them into a blind alley for the religious darkness of the Middle Ages, added Veda. But what is there that you cannot understand? It's just that I have a very poor idea of the Credo-Indian civilization. You don't know the latest researches. Traces of that civilization are now being found over a huge area from Africa, through Crete, the southern part of Central Asia, northern India, to western China. I did not suspect that in those ancient days there could have been secret treasure houses for works of art, like those of Carthage, Greece, and Rome. Come with me and you'll see, said Veda softly. Der Wieder walked beside her in silence. They were ascending a long, gentle slope and had reached the ridge when Der Wieder suddenly stopped. Thanks for your offer, I'll come. Veda turned her head towards him somewhat mistrustfully, but in the half-light of the northern night her companion's eyes were dark and impenetrable. Once past the ridge the lights turned out to be quite close. Lamps and polarizing hoods did not disperse the light rays, and that made them seem farther away than they really were. Such concentrated light was a sign of night work, and this was confirmed by a low roar that increased in volume as they neared it. Huge lattice trusses shone like silver under blue lamps high up in the air. A warning howl of sirens brought them to a standstill as the protective robots began working. Danger, keep to the left, don't approach the line of posts, shouted the loudspeaker of an invisible amplifier. They turned obediently towards a group of white portable houses. Don't look in the direction of the field, the robot continued warning them. The doors of 2 houses opened simultaneously, and 2 beams of light crossed on the dark road. A group of men and women gave the travelers a hearty welcome, but were surprised at the imperfect means of transport that had brought them there, especially at night. The cupboard-like cabin of the shower bath, with its streams of aromatic water saturated with gas and electricity, with the merry play of tiny electric charges on the skin, was a place that gave gentle pleasure. Refreshed, the travelers met at table. "Vetter, my dear, we've come across some of our colleagues," exclaimed Veda, freshly bathed and extremely young, as she poured out a golden liquid. "A tonic right now!" he exclaimed, reaching for his glass. "Bullfighter, you're growing savage in the steppes," protested Veda. "I'm telling you interesting news, and you only think of eating." "Are there excavations here?" said Der Veeder doubtingly. "There are, only they're paleontological, not archaeological. They're studying the fossilized animals of the Permian period, 200 million years old. That puts us in the shade with our petty thousands." "Are they studying them in the ground, without digging them up? How's that?" "Yes, in the ground, although as yet I don't know how." One of those sitting at the table, a thin, yellow-faced man, joined in the conversation. "Our group is now relieving another. We have just finished preparations and are about to start work on depth photography." "Hard irradiation," hazarded Der Veeder. "If you are not too tired, I would advise you to watch it. Tomorrow we shall be moving the whole apparatus to another site, and that will not be interesting." Veda and Dar gladly consented. Their hospitable hosts rose from the table and led them into a neighboring house, where protective clothing hung in niches with a clockface indicator over each of them. "There is very great ionization from our powerful electron tubes," said a tall, slightly round-shouldered woman with a faint suggestion of apology as she helped Veda into a suit of closely woven fabric and a transparent helmet, and fastened a container with batteries on her back. In the polarized light, every hillock in the steppes stood out with unnatural clarity. A dull groan came from a square space marked off by thin rails. The earth heaved, cracked, and opened up in a crater in the center of which appeared a sharp-nosed silver cylinder. Its polished walls were encircled by a spiral ridge, and the sharp end was fitted with an intricate electric milling head of blue metal rotating as the machine appeared. The cylinder rolled over the edge of the crater, turned over, showed blades that moved quickly at the rear end, and began digging in again a few meters away from the crater, diving almost vertically with its polished nose into the ground. Dar Veeder noticed a double cable that the cylinder pulled behind it. One of the cables was insulated, the other made of some highly polished metal. Veda jerked his sleeve and pointed in front of them, beyond the fence of magnesium rails. A second cylinder, similar to the first, had come out of the earth, and with just the same movements had rolled over to the left and disappeared, as though it had dived into water. The yellow-faced man made a sign to his visitors to hurry. "I remember now who he is," whispered Veda, as they hastened to overtake the group ahead of them. "He is Liao Lang, the paleontologist who discovered the secret of the settlement of the Asian continent in the Paleozoic." "Is he of Chinese origin?" asked Dar Veeder, recalling the somber glance of the scientist's slightly slant eyes. "I'm ashamed to admit it, but I don't know anything about his work." "I see you don't know much about our terrestrial paleontology," Veda remarked. "You probably know more about that of other stellar worlds." Before Dar's mind's eye, there passed the countless forms of life, millions of strange skeletons in the rocks of various planets, monuments to the past hidden in the different strata of all inhabited worlds. This was nature's memory, recorded by her until such times as a reasoning being appeared, a being not only capable of remembering but also of restoring that which had been forgotten. They went on to a small platform fixed to the end of a half-arch of latticework. In the center of the floor there was a big, unlighted screen with low benches around it on which the visitors sat and waited. "The moles will finish soon," said Liao Lang. "As you have probably guessed, they are carrying the bare wire through the rocks and weaving a metallic net. The skeletons of extinct animals lie in friable sandstone at a depth of 14 meters below the surface. Lower, at 17 meters, the whole field is covered by the metallic net, which is connected to powerful inductors. A field of reflection is thus created which throws X-rays onto the screen, giving us the image of the fossilized bones. Two big metal globes turned on massive pedestals. Floodlights were switched on, and the howl of sirens warned everybody of danger. Direct current at a tension of 1,000,000 volts filled the air with the fresh smell of ozone and made the terminals and insulators glow blue in the dark. Liao Lang was turning switches and pressing buttons on the control panel with feigned carelessness. The big screen grew brighter and brighter. In its depths, some faint, blurred outlines appeared here and there in the field of vision. All movement on the screen then ceased. The fluid outlines of a big patch became clear-cut and filled almost the whole screen. After a few more manipulations on the control panel, the onlookers saw before them the skeleton of an unknown animal showing through a hazy glow. The wide paws with their long claws were bent under the body, the long tail was curled in a loop. An outstanding feature of the skeleton was the unusual thickness of the huge bones with curved ends and ridges to which the animal's mighty muscles had been attached. The skull, with jaws clamped tight, was grinning with its front teeth. It was seen from above and looked like a bone slab with a rough, broken surface. Liao Long changed the depth of focus and the degree of enlargement until the whole screen was filled with the head of the ancient reptile that had lived 200 million years before on the banks of a river that had once flowed there. The top of the skull consisted of extraordinarily thick plates of bone, no less than 20 centimeters thick. There were bony ridges over the eye sockets, and there were similar excrescences over the temporal hollows and on the convex bones of the skull. From the back part of the skull, there rose a big cone with the opening of a tremendous parietal eye. Liao Long gave a loud gasp of admiration. Narrated could not take his eyes off the clumsy, heavy skeleton of the ancient beast that had been compelled to live as a prisoner of unresolved contradictions. Increases in muscular power had led to thicker bones that were put to great strain, and the heavier weight of the bigger bones again required a strengthening of the muscles. This direct dependence led the evolution of archaic organisms into a complete deadlock until some important physiological mutation resolved the old contradictions and brought about a new evolutionary stage. It seemed unbelievable that such creatures were amongst the ancestors of man, with his beautiful body capable of great activity and precise movements. Narrated looked at the excrescences over the brows of the Permian reptile that betrayed its stupid ferocity and compared it with lithe, supple Veda with such bright eyes in her intelligent, lively face. What a tremendous difference in the organization of living matter. Involuntarily, he squinted sideways, trying to get a glimpse of Veda's features through her helmet, and when his eyes returned to the screen, there was something else there. This was the wide, flat, parabolic head of an amphibian, the ancient salamander, doomed to lie in the warm, dark waters of a Permian swamp, waiting until something eatable came within its reach. Then, one swift leap, one snap of the jaws, and again the same eternal, patient and senseless lying in wait. Narrated felt annoyed and oppressed by pictures of the endlessly long and cruel evolution of life. He straightened up, and Liao Long, guessing his mood, suggested that they return home to rest. It was hard for Veda, with her insatiable curiosity, to tear herself away from her observations until she saw that the scientists were hurrying to switch on the machines to take electron photographs so as not to waste power. Veda was soon ensconced on a wide divan in the drawing room of the women's hostel, but Narrated remained for some little time walking up and down the smooth terrace in front of the houses, mentally reviewing his impressions. The dew of the northern morning washed the previous day's dust off the grass. The imperturbable Liao Long returned from his night's work and proposed sending his guests to the nearest aerodrome on an Elf, a small accumulator-driven car. There was a base for jumping jet aircraft 100 kilometers to the southeast, on the lower reaches of the river Trom-Yugan. Veda wanted to get in touch with her expedition, but there was no radio transmitter of sufficient power at the dig. Since our ancestors discovered the harmful influence of radioactivity and introduced strict regulation into the use of radio, directed radio communication has required much more complicated apparatus, especially for long-distance conversations. In addition to that, the number of stations has been greatly reduced. Liao Long decided to get in touch with the nearest herdsman's watchtower. These watchtowers had radio intercommunication and could also communicate directly with the center of their district. A young girl student who proposed driving the Elf in order to bring it back suggested calling in at a watchtower on the way so that the visitors could use the televisophone for their conversation. Narrated and Veda were glad of the opportunity. A strong wind blew the occasional wisps of dust away from them and ruffled the abundant short-cropped hair of their driver. There was scarcely room for the three of them in the narrow car. Narrated's huge body made it a tight fit for the two women. The slim silhouette of the watchtower was visible in the distance against the clear blue of the sky. Very soon the Elf came to a standstill at the foot of the tower. A plastic roof was built between the straddling legs of the structure where another Elf was garaged. The guide bars of a tiny lift led up through this roof and took them one by one past the living quarters, to the platform at the top of the tower where they were met by an almost naked young man. The sudden confusion displayed by their hitherto self-reliant driver gave Veda to understand that the reason for her having been so accommodating was a deep-rooted one. The circular room with crystal walls swayed noticeably, and the metal structure of the tower thrummed monotonously like a taut violin string. The floor and ceiling of the room were painted in dark colors. On the narrow, curved tables under the windows, there were binoculars, calculating machines, and notebooks. The tower, from its height of 90 meters, had a full view of the surrounding steppe as far as the limits of visibility of neighboring towers. The staff maintained constant watch over the herds and kept records of fodder supplies. The milking labyrinths, through which the herds of milk cows were driven twice a day, lay in the steppe in green concentric rings. The milk which, like that of the African antelope, did not turn sour, was poured into containers and frozen on the spot, after which it could be kept for a long time in the underground refrigerators. The herds were driven from one pasture to another with the aid of the elves kept at each of the watchtowers. The observers were mostly young people who had not completed their education, and they had plenty of time to study during their tour of duty. The young man led Veda and Darvider down a spiral staircase to living quarters suspended between the supports of the tower a few yards below the platform. The rooms were equipped with sound insulation, and the travelers found themselves in absolute silence. Only the constant swaying of the room served to remind them that they were at a height that could be dangerous in the event of the slightest carelessness. Another youth was working at the radio. The exotic hairdo and brightly colored dress of the girl in the televisophone screen showed that he was talking to the central station. Women working in the steppes wore short overall suits. The girl on the screen connected them with the zonal station, and soon the sad face and tiny figure of Mieko Igoro, Veda's chief assistant, appeared on the screen. There was pleasurable astonishment in her slightly slant eyes, like those of Liao Long, and her tiny mouth opened at the suddenness of it all. A second later, however, Vedakong and Darvader were confronted with a passionless face that expressed nothing except business-like attention. Darvader went back upstairs and found the girl student of paleontology engaged in a lively conversation with the first youth. Vedder went outside onto the veranda surrounding the circular room. The damp of early morning had long since given way to a noonday heat that robbed the colors of their freshness and leveled out irregularities in the ground. The steppe spread far and wide, under a burning, clear sky. Veeder again recalled his vague longing for the northern land of his ancestors. Leaning on the rail of the swaying platform, he could feel how the dreams of ancient peoples were coming true, and feel it with greater strength than ever before. Stern nature had been driven to the far north by the conquering hand of man, and the vitalizing warmth of the south had been poured over these great plains that had formerly lain frozen under a cold, cloudy sky. Vedakong entered the round room and announced that the radio operator had agreed to take them farther on their journey. The girl with the cropped hair thanked the historian with a long glance. Through the transparent wall they could see the broad back of Darvader as he stood there lost in contemplation. "Perhaps you were thinking of me?" he heard a voice say behind his back. "No, Veda, I was thinking of one of the postulates of ancient Indian philosophy. It was to the effect that the world is not made for man, and that man himself becomes great only when he understands the value and beauty of another life, the life of nature. That idea seems incomplete, and I don't understand it. I suppose I didn't finish it. I should have added that man alone can understand not only the beauty but also the dark and difficult sides of life. Only man possesses the ability to dream and the strength to make life better." "Now I understand," said Veda softly, and after a long pause added, "You've changed, Veeder." "Of course, I've changed. 4 months of digging with a simple spade amongst the stones and rotting logs of your kurgans is enough to change anybody. Like it or not, you begin to look at life more simply, and its simple joys become dearer to you." "Don't make a joke of it, Vetter. I'm talking seriously," said Veda with a frown. "When I first knew you, you had command over all the power of Earth, and used to speak to distant worlds. In your observatories in those days, you might well have been the supernatural being whom the ancients called God. And here, at our simple work, where you are the equal of everybody else, you have..." Veda stopped. "What have I done?" he insisted, his curiosity aroused. Have I lost my majesty? What would you have said if you'd seen me before I joined the Institute of Astrophysics, when I was an engine driver on the Spiral Way? That is still less majestic. Or a mechanic on the fruit-gathering machines in the tropics. Veda laughed loudly. I'll disclose to you a secret of my youth. When I was in the third cycle school, I fell in love with an engine driver on the Spiral Way, and at that time I could not imagine anybody with greater power. But here comes the radio operator. Come along, Veter. Before the pilot would allow Vedakong and Darveter to enter the cabin of the jumping jet aircraft, he asked for a second time whether the health of the passengers could stand the great acceleration of the machine. He stuck strictly to the rules. When he was assured that it would be safe, he seated them in deep chairs in the transparent nose of an aircraft shaped like a huge raindrop. Veda felt very uncomfortable. The seat sloped a long way back because the nose of the aircraft was raised high above the ground. The signal gong sounded. A powerful catapult hurled the plane almost vertically into the air, and Veda sank slowly into her chair as she would in some viscous liquid. Darveter, with an effort, turned his head to give Veda a smile of encouragement. The pilot switched on the engine. There was a roar, a feeling of great weight in the entire body, and the pear-shaped aircraft was on its course, describing an arc at an altitude of 23,000 meters. It seemed that only a few minutes had passed when the travelers, their knees trembling under them, got out of the plane in front of their houses in the Altai steppes, and the pilot was waving to them to get out of the way. Darveter realized that the engines would have to be started on the ground as there was no catapult there to propel the machine. He ran as fast as he could, pulling Veda after him. Miyako Igoro, running easily, came to meet them, and the two women embraced as though they had been parted for a long time.